The unlikely connection. The princess lived in a world full of wonders and dangers. Her people, a powerful alien race, ruled the galaxy with strength and wisdom. But despite her royal status, she often felt isolated. She was surrounded by guards, advisors, and other nobles. But none of them truly understood her. None of them were human. Humans were rare, seen as weak and inferior by most in her empire. Yet there was something about them that intrigued her. Among the many guards assigned to protect her, one stood out, an ordinary-looking man, but there was something extraordinary about him. His name was Marcus, and he was a human. He had been brought to the royal palace, not because of his strength or skill in combat, but because of his ability to stay calm in any situation. That was what made him different from the others. The princess had never spoken to a human before, except for those who served the royal family in menial ways. But Marcus was different. He was assigned to guard her chambers, and every time she saw him, she couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity. She was used to the stoic faces of her alien guards, who followed orders without question. But Marcus, he was different. One day, while the princess was walking through the palace gardens, she spotted him standing near a fountain, his eyes watching the flowing water. She stopped for a moment, watching him from afar. There was something about the way he stood, so composed yet somehow lost in his thoughts, that made her feel intrigued. She couldn't resist any longer. "Guard," she called out, her voice soft but firm. Marcus turned around, his face expressionless, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he saw who had spoken. "Your Highness," he said with a slight bow. "Is there anything you need?" The princess smiled a little. "I was just curious. You seem different from the others. You don't act like them." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment, his gaze shifting to the ground. He wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm not like them," he said quietly, "but I'm just here to do my duty." The princess studied him for a moment. She could tell there was more to him than just his calm exterior. He wasn't like the others who were so eager to serve and follow orders. There was something deeper in his eyes, something that caught her attention. "Tell me," she said, "do you find it hard to live among us?" Marcus looked up at her, surprised by the question. Most of the royals would never ask such a thing, but the princess wasn't like most royals. She had always felt a sense of loneliness, despite being surrounded by luxury and power. The princess, with her commanding presence, seemed unreachable to everyone around her. But Marcus, despite being only a guard, didn't treat her like a distant, untouchable queen. "It's not easy," he admitted, "but I don't mind. My duty is to protect you, Your Highness, and I take that seriously." The princess raised an eyebrow. "Do you really think humans are weak?" she asked, her voice softer now. Marcus looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. He hesitated before answering. "I don't think humans are weak," he said slowly, "but most of the galaxy does. They look down on humans because they don't understand. But I've seen humans do amazing things. Sometimes it's not about strength. Sometimes it's about the will to survive." The princess was taken aback by his words. She had always seen humans as a lesser race, something to be controlled or used. But Marcus's words challenged everything she had been taught. "Survival," she repeated, her voice filled with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Marcus's eyes softened as he spoke. "Humans are resourceful. They adapt. They fight not just to survive, but to thrive. You might not see it, but humans have an inner strength that can't be measured by just their bodies. Sometimes that strength is all they have." The princess felt a strange feeling stir within her. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. There was something else, something deeper. She had spent so many years being told what to believe, what to feel, what to expect. But Marcus had shown her a new side to the universe, a side she had never considered before. "I never thought about it that way," she said, almost to herself. "I've always been told that humans were weak. But now, I see there's more to them." Marcus nodded, not sure what to say. He wasn't trying to change her mind. He was simply speaking the truth as he saw it, but the princess felt something shifting inside her. There was an undeniable connection forming between them, one that she didn't fully understand yet. "I think you're right," the princess said quietly. "Humans are different, but I don't think it's just their strength that makes them special. It's something else, something I can't quite place." Marcus smiled slightly. "Maybe it's their hearts," he said, his voice warm. The princess looked at him, a strange flutter in her chest. Was this what it felt like to connect with someone? She had never felt this way before, especially not with a human. But there was something in Marcus's words, something in his eyes, that made her feel like she wasn't alone. For the first time in her life, the princess didn't feel like the distance between her and those around her was unbridgeable. She didn't know where this connection with Marcus would lead, but she couldn't deny that something had begun to change. And for the first time in a long while, the princess was excited about it. The unlikely connection between the princess and the human guard had only just begun. The forbidden bond. The days after their first conversation felt different for the princess. The palace, once a place of cold stone and formalities, now felt warmer, more alive. Marcus's words echoed in her mind as she went about her royal duties. Humans are more than they appear. It was a strange thought for her, one she never thought she would entertain. But somehow, when she looked at Marcus now, there was something else in her eyes. Something she hadn't noticed before. Their encounters became more frequent, though always under the guise of royal protocol. The princess would often request Marcus's presence in her chambers, though it was always for something trivial. A simple request for a drink of water. An extra cushion for her chair. At first, the interactions were filled with silence, both of them unsure of how to act. But slowly, a comfortable understanding grew between them. Neither needed to speak much, but the silence between them felt like a language of its own. It was on one of these quiet evenings, as the stars shone brightly over the palace, that their bond began to change. The princess had just finished a long day of meetings with her advisors. She was exhausted, drained by the weight of the crown that always seemed to press down on her. Her people, her empire, her duties, it was all so much to bear at times. She often wondered what it would be like to be free from it all, to live a life without the endless expectations. But Marcus, he was different. He didn't carry the same burdens as she did. His life was simpler. His role was clear, to protect her, to serve her. There was no royal bloodline to uphold, no empire to manage. His life, though filled with its own struggles, seemed free in a way hers could never be. She envied that freedom. Tonight, however, something was different. The princess was restless. She had spent hours in her chambers trying to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. So, she decided to take a walk through the palace gardens to clear her mind. The cool night air helped ease the tension in her shoulders, but her mind was still racing. She found herself wandering toward the quiet corner of the garden, where Marcus had once stood, by the fountain. The place had always been peaceful, a space where she could find a moment of solitude. When she arrived, she was surprised to find Marcus standing there, as though he had been waiting for her. He didn't turn when she approached, but she could feel his presence all the same. He must have sensed her coming, as he always did. "You're up late, Your Highness," Marcus said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of concern. "Is something troubling you?" The princess hesitated before answering. She didn't know why she had come here tonight, why she sought out his company. But there was something about him, something about the way he made her feel heard without having to say a word. For the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. "I can't sleep," she admitted softly. "I've been restless for days. There's so much to think about, so many decisions to make. Sometimes it feels like I'm carrying the weight of the whole galaxy on my shoulders." Marcus turned to face her, his eyes steady and understanding. "I can't imagine what that must be like," he said. "But I do know what it's like to carry a burden, even if it's not the same as yours." The princess raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what burden is that?" she asked. Marcus's gaze softened, and he paused for a moment before answering. The burden of always having to prove yourself. The burden of being expected to be something you're not. It's a heavy thing, to have others decide your worth before you've had the chance to show them who you are. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had always been seen as the perfect princess, the flawless heir to the throne. Her life had been dictated by her status, her family, and the expectations that came with both. She had never been allowed to be anything but what others wanted her to be. But now, hearing Marcus's words, she realized that he understood what it was like to live in the shadow of someone else's expectations, even if his were not as grand as hers. "You understand," she said, more to herself than to him. "You understand what it's like to feel like you're not in control of your own life." Marcus nodded. "I do. But the difference is, you have the power to change that. You can choose your path. Maybe it won't be easy, but you can choose." The princess looked at him, her heart pounding. There it was again, the feeling that had been growing between them. A connection that went beyond mere words. She was no longer just the princess, and he was no longer just her guard. They were two people, two souls, who understood each other in a way no one else could. But this bond was forbidden. She knew that. Her people would never accept it. Her family would never allow it. The thought of defying the empire, of being with a human in a way no royal should, terrified her. But at the same time, it exhilarated her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly alive. "I wish things were different," the princess said softly. "I wish I could just live my life without the chains of my title, without the expectations of my people." Marcus's eyes softened. "I can't give you that life, Your Highness. But if I could, I would. I would give you a life where you could be free, where you could choose for yourself." The princess's heart raced. His words, his sincerity, they made her feel something she had never felt before. But she knew the risks. She knew what it would mean if anyone found out about their growing bond. The consequences would be disastrous. And yet, as she looked into Marcus's eyes, the fears seemed to fade away. It was as if, in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the empire, not her family, not the rules and expectations, only the two of them. "We can't," she whispered, though her voice was filled with uncertainty. "It's too dangerous." Marcus didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence comforting, yet full of tension. "Maybe it's dangerous," he said, his voice low. "But sometimes, the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards." The princess felt a surge of emotion that she couldn't explain. She was drawn to him in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. In that moment, she knew that their bond could no longer be ignored. It had already begun to change everything. Everything she had ever known. And there was no going back. But the question lingered in the air. Would they dare to risk everything for a love that had no place in their world? The moment that changed everything. The days that followed were filled with an undercurrent of tension, something both the princess and Marcus could feel but dared not acknowledge. Every time their eyes met, there was a spark, something more than just the casual exchange of a royal and her guard. There was a new understanding between them, one that neither could deny but both tried to ignore. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal, and every passing moment only solidified the connection that was quickly becoming impossible to ignore. Yet, the world they lived in had no room for such emotions. The princess spent hours pondering the strange pull she felt whenever she was near Marcus. She had been raised to lead with a heart full of duty, not desire. Yet, the emotions stirring inside her were unlike anything she had ever known. Marcus had become more than just her protector. He had become her confidant, the one person who truly saw her for who she was, not just the princess they all expected her to be. One evening, when the stars were particularly bright, the princess decided to take a break from her royal duties. The palace was full of whispers and pressure, the weight of her title threatening to smother her spirit. She needed to escape, even if only for a moment. She wandered into the private gardens again, drawn there by the same pull she had felt before. She didn't know what had made her do it, but she found herself standing near the same fountain where they had met days earlier. There was no one else around, and the quiet of the night seemed to wrap around her like a comforting blanket. The sound of water flowing was soothing, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a small sense of peace. As if summoned by her thoughts, Marcus appeared, stepping out from behind a nearby pillar, as though he had been watching over her from a distance. He was always so vigilant, so aware of his surroundings. His presence had become a constant in her life, something both grounding and unsettling. "Your Highness," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the night air. "You seem troubled." The princess didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. It wasn't just the weight of his words or his position as her guard that made her pause. It was the way he looked at her, his gaze never once wavering, never once filled with fear of the consequences of being close to her. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. "I don't know what to do anymore, Marcus," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I feel like I'm suffocating in this role, like I'm trapped in a life that's not my own." Marcus's expression softened. He stepped closer, but not too close. There was still a respect in his distance, a boundary neither dared cross. "You don't have to carry the weight of the galaxy alone," he said quietly. "I know your life is not your own, Your Highness, but that doesn't mean you can't find moments of freedom in it, even if they're small." The princess met his eyes, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something she had not allowed herself to feel. His words, so simple, resonated with her in ways she couldn't explain. They were both trapped in their roles, bound by the expectations of others. Yet in this moment, with him standing before her, she felt seen. She wasn't just the princess. She wasn't just the ruler in waiting. She was someone who had feelings, someone who needed to break free. Without thinking, she stepped closer to him, her gaze fixed on his face. The space between them felt charged, electric, and for the first time, the princess wasn't afraid of what might happen if she allowed herself to feel this way. Marcus hesitated but then reached out, gently touching her arm. The contact was brief, but it was enough to send a wave of warmth through her body. "You don't have to pretend with me, Your Highness," he said softly. "I know what it's like to live under the weight of others' expectations. I know what it's like to want more." The princess felt a lump form in her throat. His words were like a balm to her wounded soul, a soul that had been torn between duty and desire for so long. She wanted more, more than the cold stone walls of her palace, more than the constant demands of her people, more than the suffocating expectations of her family. She wanted something real, something for herself. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she wondered what it would be like to reach out and take his hand, to allow herself to have this one thing, this one person, who saw her for who she truly was. It was a dangerous thought, one that could ruin her life, her future, her family's legacy. But it was also the one thing that made her feel alive. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't know what to do. I feel like if I follow this connection with you, everything I've worked for, everything I've been told to protect, will fall apart." Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, he stepped closer until they were standing just inches apart. The air around them felt thick with unspoken words, with feelings neither of them had dared express until now. His hand, once lightly touching her arm, now hovered just inches from hers. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet of the night, caught in a moment that could change everything. "You don't have to choose between your duty and your heart," Marcus finally said, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes life doesn't give us a choice, but that doesn't mean we can't follow our hearts anyway. I would walk with you, wherever that path takes us." The princess's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced. The words "follow our hearts" felt like a promise, a dangerous promise, one that she wasn't sure she could accept. But in that moment, with Marcus standing before her, offering her a glimpse of something different, something real. She couldn't help but wish for it. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if it's too late? What if the consequences are too great?" The silence between them stretched long before Marcus finally answered. His voice was low, almost a sigh. "Then we face them together. If you're willing to risk everything, so am I." And just like that, the princess knew. Everything had changed. The moment she had been avoiding had arrived, and there was no going back. The connection between them could no longer be ignored. It was real, it was dangerous, and it was something they both wanted. The princess reached out and took Marcus's hand, and for the first time in her life, she felt free. The scandal unfolds. The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension and suppressed whispers. The princess and Marcus found themselves caught in a game they never chose to play. Every moment they shared felt charged with an undeniable energy, a connection growing stronger despite the walls built around them by duty, fear, and tradition. But as their bond deepened, so did the risk. They both knew it. There was no escaping the consequences of their actions, no matter how much they wished otherwise. The palace, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison to the princess. Every glance from the royal council felt like a silent judgment. Every word from her advisors carried the weight of expectations. Expectations that did not include Marcus in the princess's world. Her family, her people, her future, they were all at risk. And yet there was nothing she could do to erase the feelings that had already taken root in her heart. But the secrecy could only last so long. One evening, as the princess walked the halls of the palace, her thoughts consumed by everything and nothing, she was startled by the sound of hurried footsteps. She turned sharply, only to see one of the royal servants rushing toward her, her face pale with fear. "Your Highness," the servant gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "There's something you need to see. It's about you." The princess's heart sank. She could already sense the danger in the servant's voice. "What is it?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The servant hesitated before speaking. "There are whispers, Your Highness. News from the palace. Rumors about you and the human guard." The princess froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had feared this moment, the moment when their secret would no longer be theirs to keep. The rumors had spread far faster than she expected. Her connection with Marcus, the late-night conversations, the stolen moments, they had been noticed. And now, the entire palace was talking. "Where did these rumors come from?" the princess asked, her voice tight with barely contained panic. "I don't know, Your Highness," the servant said, her voice shaking. "But it's already spreading. The nobles they're talking. The council is already in session. They'll be discussing it soon. There are whispers of a scandal, a disgrace." The princess's mind raced. She felt the walls of her world begin to close in around her. She had known this would happen. Her bond with Marcus was forbidden, but she had never imagined it would escalate so quickly. A scandal wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to her family, to the entire empire. If the royal family's reputation was tarnished, it could have disastrous consequences for everyone involved. Without saying another word, the princess hurried to her chambers, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew she had to act fast, but she wasn't sure what to do. The entire palace seemed to be buzzing with the news of her and Marcus, and the scandal would soon reach the ears of her father, the emperor. Once it did, there would be no escaping the consequences. By the time she arrived in the council room, her heart was in her throat. She could already hear the hushed voices of the nobles, their whispers sharp with judgment. The princess took a deep breath and entered the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the gathered council members. They all turned to her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Her father, the emperor, sat at the head of the table, his gaze cold and calculating. He had always been a man of strict rules and unwavering authority, and the last thing he tolerated was any form of rebellion within the royal family. The princess's actions, her bond with Marcus, would be seen as nothing less than treason. "You've heard the rumors, I'm sure," the emperor said, his voice low and controlled. "Tell me, daughter, how do you explain this situation?" The princess felt the weight of his gaze upon her, and for a moment she considered lying, pretending that there was nothing between her and Marcus, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But she knew it wouldn't work. The truth had already been exposed, and there was no escaping it. I can explain, father," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "Marcus is my guard, but he is also my friend. He has been nothing but loyal to me, and I—" "Friend," the emperor interrupted, his voice rising with anger. "Do you think I am a fool? This is no friendship, and you know it. You have shamed your position, your bloodline, your empire. The people are talking. The nobles are furious. How could you be so reckless?" The princess swallowed hard, trying to hold her ground. "I did not mean for this to happen, father. It's not what you think. Marcus is different. He is not like the others. He has shown me kindness, loyalty, things I have not found elsewhere. And I cannot ignore the bond we share." Her words, though honest, were met with silence. The council members exchanged glances, their faces filled with disapproval. The princess knew they would never accept her feelings for Marcus, no matter how pure or sincere they were. They saw him as nothing more than a human, a lesser being, beneath her. "You speak of kindness and loyalty," the emperor said, his voice icy. "But what you fail to see is the damage this will do. The people will lose faith in their ruler. Your actions will have consequences not just for you, but for the entire empire. The integrity of the royal family is at stake." The princess felt the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. She had known the consequences of her bond with Marcus, but hearing them spoken aloud made them feel real, unavoidable. She had never imagined her feelings for Marcus would come to this. It had started as something small, something innocent, but now it was a full-blown scandal that could unravel everything. "We will need to handle this swiftly," the emperor continued. "There must be no trace of this affair. If word of this spreads any further, we risk losing the trust of our people. You will put an end to this now. Is that understood?" The princess felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest. She could feel Marcus's presence in the back of her mind, even though he was not in the room. She knew she couldn't just walk away from him. But she also knew the reality of the situation. Her family's empire, her future, depended on her obedience. If she defied her father's orders, she risked everything. She nodded slowly, her heart heavy with sorrow. "I understand, father," she said, her voice breaking slightly. The emperor's expression softened just slightly, but it was clear he was pleased with her compliance. "Good. We will arrange for Marcus to be removed from the palace. His presence here is no longer welcome. You will go back to your duties as the heir, and we will never speak of this again." The princess didn't reply. She couldn't. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. The life she had imagined, one where she could be free, one where she could choose, was slipping away, piece by piece. Her bond with Marcus was now a dangerous secret, one that threatened to destroy everything she had worked for. And yet, as the council session drew to a close, as her father's words echoed in her mind, one thought remained. Would she really let go of Marcus? Would she truly sacrifice the one thing that made her feel alive for the sake of a title, a family, a future she didn't want? The question haunted her as the doors of the council chamber closed behind her. The betrayal. The days that followed the council meeting were a blur of cold duty and painful compliance. The princess went through the motions of royal life, greeting ambassadors, attending meetings, and fulfilling her obligations with a precision that was nearly robotic. But inside, she was unraveling. Every step she took felt like a betrayal to herself. Her heart ached with every moment she spent away from Marcus. The harsh decision to sever their bond, no matter how temporary it seemed, had hollowed her out. She had chosen duty over love, a decision that clawed at her soul. The princess spent hours in her private chambers, staring out at the palace gardens. She had stopped visiting the fountain where she and Marcus had once shared their quiet, stolen moments. It hurt too much to even think of that place. Yet, as the days wore on, the weight of the decision grew heavier, pressing down on her chest with an unbearable force. But things were not as they seemed in the palace. No matter how much the princess tried to bury her emotions, whispers swirled around the royal halls like a dangerous storm. She could feel it every time she entered a room, every time she exchanged words with the court officials. There was something in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before, and it had nothing to do with her broken heart. One evening, as she made her way through the grand corridors of the palace, the princess overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. A group of high-ranking nobles were gathered near a marble pillar, their voices low but distinct enough to be heard. As she approached, one word caught her ear: betrayal. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "They say the princess is nothing but a pawn now," one noble was saying, her voice laced with venom. "That human has corrupted her. She's weak, a liability to the throne." "She always was too emotional," another replied. "And now it's clear. A princess who'd risk everything for a mere human is no use to the empire. She's a disgrace." The princess stopped in her tracks, the icy sting of the words cutting through her like a dagger. The disgrace. The term stung more than she expected. These were her people, the ones who had supported her all her life. And yet, they were now questioning her worth, reducing her to nothing more than a scandal. Her stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had never realized just how much the nobles despised her choices, her emotions, her humanity. But then she heard something else, something that sent a wave of nausea through her. Someone had to do something about it. A third voice spoke, hushed but filled with conviction. The princess was out of control. She couldn't be trusted. So, I made sure it would stop. The princess's heart skipped a beat. She recognized that voice. It was the voice of Lady Kiara, one of the closest advisors to her father, someone who had always been regarded as a loyal servant to the royal family. Lady Kiara, a woman whose sharp eyes and cold demeanor had always made the princess uneasy, was the last person she had expected to be involved in anything like this. "Wait," another noble said, voice tinged with surprise. "You mean, you told the emperor? You were the one who made sure the news got to him?" Lady Kiara's voice was chillingly calm. "I did what needed to be done." The princess was far too distracted by her human. It's time she learned the cost of her actions. The princess could hardly breathe. Her mind raced as the implications of the conversation hit her like a wave. It wasn't just that her secret had been discovered. It was that someone from her inner circle, had betrayed her. Lady Kiara had played her part in the scandal, ensuring that the princess's bond with Marcus would be exposed, and now it seemed she was doing everything in her power to make sure it would lead to the princess's downfall. The anger that surged within her was immediate and fierce. Lady Kiara, who had smiled at her so sweetly in the past, had turned on her in the cruelest way possible. The princess had trusted her, believed in her loyalty to the royal family. But now, it was clear that Lady Kiara had seen the princess's bond with Marcus as a threat, a dangerous, uncontrollable force that needed to be stopped at any cost. She had manipulated the truth, twisted it into something grotesque, and used it as a weapon to tear apart the princess's life. The princess had to stop herself from running into the room to confront Lady Kiara and the nobles. Instead, she retreated back into the shadows, her pulse quickening, her breath ragged with the weight of the revelation. She couldn't let them see her, not now. Not when her world had just crumbled around her. As she retreated back to her chambers, the realization set in. Her bond with Marcus had been turned into a weapon. And Lady Kiara wasn't the only one who had used it against her. The entire palace had turned against her, driven by their need to protect the status quo. They were terrified of what she and Marcus represented. Something different, something that could break the boundaries of tradition. and they weren't willing to let it happen. The princess locked herself in her room, her mind spinning with thoughts of Marcus. She had failed him. She had allowed herself to be manipulated, to be used as a pawn in a game she didn't understand. And now, the consequences were more severe than she could have imagined. She had lost more than just the possibility of a future with him. She had lost her trust in those closest to her. She had lost the ability to be the person she had hoped to be. Her heart was shattered by the betrayal of the people she had once believed were her allies. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a comm device to contact Marcus. He needed to know the truth. He needed to know that everything had changed. But as she pressed the button to send the message, a sudden realization hit her. Was Marcus truly safe? Was the betrayal of Lady Kiara the only betrayal she would face? The princess didn't know how much more she could endure. Her world, once certain and predictable, had become a battlefield. Every move she made seemed to bring her closer to the edge, and she wasn't sure if there was anything left to hold on to. As she stared at the comm device, her mind heavy with doubt and fear, she realized that the true battle was just beginning. The fallout from the betrayal had only just begun, and the forces now closing in on her were more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. And worst of all, she didn't know if she could protect herself, or Marcus, from the storm that was coming. The fallout. The princess awoke the following morning to a world that no longer felt familiar. The grand halls of the palace, which had once been a place of regal luxury, now felt suffocating. Each step she took echoed louder, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She had always known the consequences of living a life outside the lines of duty. But nothing could have prepared her for the storm that was now raging around her. The events of the past few days were a blur. Her betrayal, the whispering nobles, the cold judgment of her father. The weight of it all pressed down on her like an unbearable weight, and she could barely breathe. Her decision to cut ties with Marcus had been hard enough, but the aftermath of that choice was something entirely different. The whispers were louder than ever. Her name was no longer spoken with reverence or respect. It was uttered with disdain, with suspicion, with pity. There was a growing sense of betrayal that hung in the air, not just from her enemies, but from her own people. Even the servants who had once smiled and bowed before her now avoided her gaze. It was as though her very existence had become a stain on the royal family, a scandal that threatened to stain the very bloodline she was supposed to protect. But worse than the betrayal of her court was the betrayal she had endured in her heart. She had been manipulated, her bond with Marcus turned into a weapon by Lady Kiara and others who saw her as nothing more than a puppet. She had been blind to the schemes around her, and now she felt lost in the aftermath of it all. Her relationship with Marcus, the one pure thing in her life, had been torn away, and she wasn't sure how much of herself was left after the storm had passed. Still, the princess couldn't forget Marcus. Every time she closed her eyes, his face haunted her, his quiet strength, and the way he had looked at her, as if she was the most important person in the galaxy. She had trusted him, and now it felt as if she had failed him. What had started as a forbidden connection between a princess and a human had grown into something more, a love, a bond that couldn't be erased, no matter how hard she tried. But now she had to live with the consequences of her choices. The princess had been summoned to her father's chambers that morning, and she knew it would be a confrontation she could not avoid. She had failed in his eyes, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. When she arrived, her father was already seated at his grand desk, his hands folded before him. His expression was as hard as stone, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he had been preparing for this moment for days, maybe even weeks. He didn't look at her when she entered. Instead, he continued to stare at the documents in front of him, as though the very sight of her was something he had grown accustomed to tolerating, not loving. "You've made your decision, haven't you, daughter?" The emperor's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You've chosen him over everything else, over your duty, over your future, over your people." The princess swallowed hard, but she couldn't bring herself to answer immediately. What could she say? She had chosen love, but love had been the one thing forbidden to her all her life. And now, it was the reason she stood here, before her father, facing the full weight of her mistakes. "Father," she began, her voice trembling slightly, but she pushed forward. "I didn't choose him to harm the Empire. I chose him because he showed me something no one else had ever shown me. He showed me kindness, loyalty, the things I had been searching for in a world that is built on power and control. But I see now that I've made a mistake." The Emperor's gaze shifted to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and something darker. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice laced with disdain. "You think this is a mistake? You shattered everything, your reputation, the royal family standing, and worst of all, the trust of your people. This was never about love, my daughter. This was about weakness. You were weak. You let yourself be distracted by a human." The princess felt the sting of his words, but she refused to let him see how deeply they had cut. She was no longer the little girl who sought her father's approval at all costs. She was a woman who had chosen to follow her heart, even if it meant giving up everything she had known. "I may have made a mistake," she said quietly, meeting her father's gaze with newfound strength. "But I am still your daughter, and I still want what's best for our people. I would never willingly harm this empire." Her father's lips curled into a thin smile, one that was both bitter and cruel. "What's best for the empire, your empire, is not driven by the whims of your heart. It's driven by duty, by loyalty to the crown, by maintaining the image of strength and superiority that we have built over generations. You fail to understand that. And now, the consequences are far-reaching." The princess felt the weight of his words, but a spark of defiance kindled in her chest. She could no longer stay silent. If the empire is built on lies, then maybe it doesn't deserve to survive, she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of the truth she had just spoken. Her father's face darkened at her words, but he didn't immediately react. For a long moment, there was silence between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, slowly, he stood from his desk and walked over to her, his presence looming like a shadow. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that should have felt comforting, but now felt cold and oppressive. "You've become a liability," he said, his voice low. "The people no longer trust you. The nobles no longer see you as their heir. You've tarnished your name, and you've put all of us in danger. You're no longer fit to rule. You've made your choice. Now, you will have to live with it." The princess's heart dropped. She had always known this moment would come, but hearing it from his lips, hearing him say it so coldly, was like a knife twisting in her chest. Her entire future was slipping away, her dreams of leading the empire crumbling beneath her feet. "You will remain here in the palace, under house arrest," the emperor continued, "until further notice. You are stripped of your position as heir. Your actions have made it impossible for me to trust you, and Marcus will be dealt with accordingly." The princess's world shattered in an instant. She had been so focused on the personal betrayal she had suffered, on the broken relationship with Marcus, that she had failed to realize just how far the consequences of her choices would reach. It was not just her life that was at stake, it was Marcus's too. The man she loved, the man who had shown her loyalty and compassion, was now a target. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg her father for mercy, to plead for Marcus's safety. But no words came. The cold weight of reality settled over her, suffocating her every thought. Her father was right. The damage had already been done. The empire, her family, her future, it all hung by a fragile thread, and she had no idea how to repair it. All she could do now was wait for the storm to come, and pray that somehow Marcus would be safe. But deep down, she feared that nothing would ever be the same again. A new beginning. The days blurred together after the emperor's cold declaration. The princess spent most of her time in her private chambers, the once vibrant walls of the palace now feeling more like a prison than a place of royal splendor. Her heart was heavy with the consequences of her choices, her dreams of a future with Marcus slipping further away with every passing hour. The palace, which had once been a place of power and authority, now felt like a gilded cage. She had lost everything: her position, her family's trust, and the love she had so desperately fought for. But in the silence of her confinement, something began to shift within her. The weight of her father's words, though crushing, had ignited a spark within her, a fire she hadn't known existed. She had always been taught to follow the path laid out for her, to never stray from the rigid lines of duty and tradition. But in the quiet moments alone, when the echoes of the palace faded into the background, she began to question everything. She had been a pawn in her father's game, a piece to be moved around to serve the empire's needs. But now, as she sat in the solitude of her room, she realized she was more than just the role she had been born into. She was her own person. She had made a choice for herself, for her heart. And that choice was worth fighting for. As much as it pained her, the princess knew there was no turning back. The life she had known, the life of comfort and royal expectation, was gone. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to create a new life, one built on her own terms. She could no longer stay confined within the walls of the palace, suffocating under the weight of her father's decisions. She had lost the title of heir. She had lost her place within the empire. But she hadn't lost herself, and neither had Marcus. The thought of him filled her with both sorrow and longing. She had been separated from him for days now, the knowledge that he was likely under the same scrutiny and pressure weighing heavily on her heart. She had no idea where he was or what had become of him. The last time they had spoken, he had promised that he would be there, no matter the cost. But she couldn't help but wonder, had he been forced into hiding? Or worse, had the palace already found a way to silence him? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was soft, hesitant, as though whoever was on the other side feared the wrath of her father just as much as she did. She stood slowly, her heart racing as she approached the door. The person who entered was not a royal servant, nor an advisor. It was someone she hadn't expected, a face she hadn't seen in days, a face she had been longing to see. Marcus. Her breath caught in her throat as the sight of him filled her vision. His eyes, though tired and worn, softened when they met hers. His face was shadowed with worry, but his presence was a balm to her weary soul. He was here. He had come for her, despite everything. "Marcus," the princess whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you." He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. "You haven't lost me," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "I'm here. I'll always be here." The princess's heart surged with relief, but the weight of their situation quickly descended upon her again. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning his face for any signs of injury or distress. "What happened? Are you safe?" She couldn't help but feel the urgency in her voice, the need to protect him now that everything had fallen apart. Marcus gave a half smile, his usual stoic expression still there, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "They tried to break me. They tried to separate us, but they couldn't. They couldn't touch me, not in the way they wanted to." The princess felt a mix of anger and gratitude flood through her. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I should have done more. I should have fought harder to keep us together." "Don't apologize," Marcus said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You've done more than enough. You chose your heart, and that's more than I could ever ask for. We've been through too much together to let this tear us apart." She took his hand in hers, her fingers trembling as she squeezed it tightly. "But what now? What can we do? My father won't stop until he's destroyed everything we've built." Marcus's gaze hardened, a determination rising in his chest. "Then we leave. We leave together." The princess's eyes widened in shock. "Leave? But where would we go? The Empire will search for us everywhere. They'll never stop hunting us down." "It doesn't matter," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. "We don't need the Empire. We don't need the palace. We need each other, and we can find a way to make it work. Out there, in the stars. I know a place, a distant world where we can live without fear. We can start fresh, build something new. No more running from our past. Just us. For a long moment, the princess didn't speak. She could feel the weight of his words pressing into her, forcing her to consider something she had never thought possible. Could she really leave everything behind? Could she truly walk away from the empire, from the family who had ruled for generations? The thought terrified her, but at the same time, it filled her with something else, something more powerful than fear. Freedom. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure this is what you want? To run away with me, knowing the risks, the consequences?" Marcus's smile softened, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. As long as you're by my side, I'll follow you anywhere." The princess's heart swelled with emotion. She had spent so long living for others, trying to fulfill the expectations placed on her. But now she had a choice. A chance for something real. Something that wasn't shaped by the will of the empire. Something that belonged only to her and Marcus. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a quiet but undeniable strength. "Wherever you lead, I'll follow. We'll make a new life, together. No more hiding. No more fear. Just us." And so, with those words, they made their decision. The princess and the human guard would leave the empire behind. They would escape the shackles of royalty, the suffocating expectations of her birthright, and embark on a journey into the unknown. Together, they would build a new life, one where they could be free to love and live on their own terms. As they left the palace that night, the stars above seemed brighter than ever before, as if they were guiding them toward a new beginning. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be dangers, challenges, and countless obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, the princess felt a sense of peace. She had found her freedom, her future, and her place in the universe. And with Marcus by her side, she knew that whatever the galaxy had in store for them, they would face it together. They were no longer bound by the past. They were free to chart their own course, to make their own destiny. And that was just the beginning.